And truth in advertising at the beginning, I am not currently a bicycle rider. I run. So I think that I'm not going to be talking to you as a kind of fanatical bike advocate. However, many of the aspects of this are going to deal with bike systems and the good things that can happen when we have healthy bike-related interaction. So I hope the font is going to be big enough, but the introduction slide here, this is a stock photograph from the COGO system, which we'll talk about throughout the talk. There's really a broad interest in bicycle use as a means of encouraging healthy outdoor activity, as well as possibly a mode of transportation, not just for recreation and for going on a tour or a hike, but to have a mode of transportation for work in certain circumstances or for connecting to activities in the city. So the purpose of the talk here today is to introduce you to what are called bicycle sharing systems, which you may have heard of, but these are typically bikes that you don't own. You pick them up from a bike rack and you can return them at another bike rack. And these are fixed stations and you can use the equipment to facilitate your interaction. So it's kind of a shared mode of transportation. And as we go through the talk and as we maybe get more expansive about this, you may see some parallels with, say, car-to-go or other shared mode systems or other non-conventional modes of transportation. So this is not about vehicles or subway trains or heavy rail. This is about a very flexible mode of transportation that in certain circumstances has some very advantageous uses. So one thing you may want to know is that in 2013, there were actually 600,000 shared bikes in 600 different systems throughout the world, including cities that you've heard of, the city of Dublin, where I'm from, Vienna, Paris, Rio, where I've seen the system in operation, Berlin, and now Columbus. So we have a new bike sharing system in Columbus called COGO. Yeah. Oh, yeah, the ... here covers all the other ones. We have hundreds of different systems, but of course, DC. So the purpose of the talk today is to both talk about local examples concerning Columbus and a bigger set of challenges on a larger scale, but primarily to take advantage of the fact that Columbus so far is a relatively small system that's in the growing stages, and so we can somehow get our hands around a relatively small system and provide some insights based on, if you want to call it, the growing pains or the beginnings of a nascent system here in Columbus. So bicycle sharing systems are, at least in the current configuration, are conveyed pretty nicely by this one slide. There's bikes, there's stations or fixed locations where the bikes are checked in and out, and there's some kind of authentication or payment or membership validation system. And so there's a lot of hardware here, so you can imagine there's pretty high expense in setting some of these up, especially in this format. We're talking about design and layout and electronic gadgets and communicating with systems, and probably a heavy amount of engineering goes into setting these stations up. So they're not a trivial undertaking. And in the case of Columbus right now, you may have seen these around, but there are 30 stations in the city of Columbus. Okay, I want to mention 3 viewpoints that you might take in looking at these systems. And today it's going to be a little bit more about the actual physical hardware and bikes than the people. But of course, the system is there to facilitate mobility by the subscribers and the people. So it's people mobility we're interested in, but it's actually the hardware that we can study because there's information technology that tells us about the operation of the system. So in fact, we could take a perspective that looks at individual users and subscribers to the system and find out, how are people using the system, where are they going, what are they doing with the bikes. We could take a fixed infrastructure point of view that might appeal to planners. Where are we going to put these stations? How big should they be? How many should there be? What are the installation aspects of the infrastructure? The first one, of course, would get us into some issues about individual privacy and are we going to track people's use of the bikes? And in fact, we're not going to do that at all. We're going to track the bikes, how people are using those bikes to get around the city. We could also have, and this may be a primary theme of the talk, would be to look at the equipment in the system, the need to balance and maintain the system. Because there are as we discovered, there's a pretty large number of operational and planning problems that arise when you start one of these things in motion. They have, once you see it, kind of anticipated issues, and balance is a big one of them, that the bikes end up in the wrong place. And just to get very quickly to an image that will convey the thought to you, supposing you have a city with a bike station on the top of a hill and a train station at the bottom of the hill. The bikes are going to end up down at the bottom of the hill, and no one's going to want to take them back up. So bike imbalance is a fundamental problem in all of these systems. Columbus doesn't quite have that yet, but we do have some issues that we're going to show you. At the national level, and I'm just conveying the big picture, there's details behind all of this, but recently the New York Times ran a kind of a scathing overview of the business model of various players in this system. There are some national franchise chains that run the operations within cities, and the New York Times pointed out a number of struggles that large systems experience as they try to adjust service and maintenance levels to be commensurate with whatever revenue streams and whatever contracts they promise the cities to provide. So there are challenges to the providers, and there are challenges that in some ways are not even of their own making. So you get a large storm comes to a city and wrecks a whole bunch of equipment. You know, you didn't plan for that, but now you have a huge maintenance issue that you hadn't thought about. So that's actually one of the reasons that New York, for instance, had a stunning overrun in some of its costs. Another little vignette I heard was that of all the systems, of all the bikes that are currently still operational in Paris, none of those bikes are the ones that were there on day one. So somehow the entire fleet at this stage has either been broken, replaced, or stolen, or moved out of service. So huge turnover of equipment. These are not things you'd think of till you start looking at the details. So in revenue terms, you need to have a price for the user that's attractive, some sort of fee that's attractive for casual service, and maybe some buy-in from corporate sponsors and underwriters. Now, I'm not a policy expert, but I think if you got into some applied economic questions, you would certainly have some great issues here about, you know, pricing policy, how to encourage the correct cost-benefit ratio, and how to maybe figure out a way to get large corporate sponsors to underwrite what, as it comes down to it, is fundamentally going to be a money-losing proposition. It's very difficult to collect enough at the fare box for any transit-related operation to pay for the actual system. You need some deep pockets to help with it. That's true across the board. So the challenges would be, if you could imagine that you're the bike operator, you're trying to persuade a city to take a contract with you, you're going to propose a level of service that you'll say the bikes will be available and there'll be so many of them. And you have to obviously make this attractive in terms of price and availability and the scope and the size of the system in order to get into that contractual arrangement. And then once you've made it, then you need to deliver, so that the issues of contract and sustainability of the system are clearly open questions. And that, again, would be an applied economics or an applied policy question of fairly large remit, and something that I'm sure lots of people would like to know some of the good ways to do these things. As it happens, I'm going straight to an example here from Columbus. There is also, I guess you could think of it as a sort of public visibility aspect to this, that it makes sense for people to know about your system. This exhibits what we might think of as network effects. The more people know about it, the more your system is used. The more your system is used, the more people know about it, and there's kind of a positive reinforcing feedback. So Kogo, that's the local system here, is on Facebook. They have advertising. This is Mayor Coleman in a photograph on a bicycle, and there's efforts to excite interest. So again, truth in advertising, I'm quite excited about the system, and some of my research is hopefully going to help Kogo do a good job or even a better job in advancing their system. So I'm an advocate, but at the same time I'm interested in taking a data analysis viewpoint on the information. So I'm a geographer, so I'm going to start with location. So location means where are the stations, how many are there, and what's the size of those stations. And as you'll get into this, you'll notice there are questions about not just how many bikes we have, but a moment's thought, you have to also have slots to put the bikes back into. So there have to be both vacancies and available bikes. And these are complicated questions, but once you set them up, you need to set up prices and fees and protocols, if you want to call it that, for how the system may be used. Anybody have a COGO membership or have used the bike system? Yep, good. Do you have an annual membership or use it casually? Okay, well, you can buy an annual membership which entitles you to use the bike in a certain way, and casually you can go up and put old-fashioned cash in the machine and take the bike for a 24-hour period. There are restrictions that stop that bike from, what's to stop you taking it to the Hocking Hills for the weekend? Well, they have a 30-minute check-in window, and the bike has to be re-clicked back in. And we'll come back to that as a major operational requirement of their system. So here's a map. It's actually a photograph of their map, so it's not a really geographically stunning portrayal here, but there's a set of dots on here representing the locations of the stations. We'll show you some more details on that as we go through. But here's the thing that will get you immediately thinking about this. I went online on March the 28th, and using their system, I checked the availability of bikes at all their stations. So the 30 stations are listed here, and it's kind of small in font, but what you will notice is that for every station, there is both the number of available bikes, like 10, 11, and the number of available open slots, say 8. So each station has a number of bikes and a number of slots, and the bikes come in and out over time. And therein lies the problem. The temporal movement of bikes in and out of these stations has a very high, if you want to call it stochastic or random part that is difficult to model and is going to perhaps produce imbalances. But on a good day, and when things are kind of in equilibrium, so to speak, there are exactly as many bikes, 217, as there are slots, and they're distributed reasonably 50-50 across the entire sets of stations. So this would be the system in balance. Now, what I'm going to show you is that you wind the clock forward, bikes start moving to places and end up essentially stuck in one place and fewer of them elsewhere. So this is one example. Any time of the day, you can click on COGO's website, and it will show you this type of map, which is a symbol with a kind of a red full-up bar, which tells you of the available bikes that might occur at each of the stations. So this is actually a station at Front and Beck. It's down near the Klada in the German village area, near the Germania Club. That station, when I checked on the 18th of September, just a couple of days ago, actually had 13 bikes and 2 slots. So the thing was full up of bikes. So you're in good shape if you want to get a bike, but you're in danger of not being able to find a place to put the bike if you turn up there. So there again is an instance of the issue we're going to try and model. Okay? And this is a photograph or a screenshot from their online app. You can check their stations at any time. Ideally, if you think about it, you'd probably want these to all be half full or half empty. So there's a context for spatial analysis. And chatting with Nikki, I was pleased to hear that there's an interest in sort of spatial and geographic information systems angles of this. So this is a very full question in terms of quantitative spatial problems. There's a gold mine of questions here in terms of queuing, location, pricing, economic analysis, and the literature really has, as I started delving into this, quite a lot of work on this already. There's a huge amount of literature, surveys, and people doing time evolution of where the literature is, and we're probably on our 3rd or 4th generation of approach to this problem right now. So it's a very mature set of analytical questions. And mostly people are trying to improve these bike systems from an engineering perspective and from a geographical perspective. So there are data in my talk. So I wouldn't call it big data, but there are quite a large amount of information. So I've got a hold of the data for April to mid-August 2014, accounting for about 28,000 trips. Trip meaning the bike was checked out, was used, and was checked back in. And we're interested in basic questions such as the location and demand for interaction on the basis of the fixed points in the system And we want to get some experience from the data about how are people actually using this. And again, I remind you of my caveat. I'm not talking about the individual people. I'm talking about the individual bikes. So I don't know what Joe or Mary or Pat were doing on the bike, but they got the bike from A to B. And that's what we need to know. So I don't know if you remember winter 2013, but you probably needed a skidoo rather than a bicycle. It was a pretty harsh winter. And so I'm going to skip Q3 of 2013, Q4 of 2013, and Q1 of 2014. This was not good weather for bicycles of any kind, shared or otherwise. So I'm going to start here with Q2 of 2014 and Q3 of 2014, which is right now. It's actually going to end in September 30th. So actually, I have slightly incomplete data for the final quarter. I do have 135 days of data, which is a pretty good amount of information. And this is a measure you might think about. I have 31,000 bike days. So this is available bikes by days. So if you add them all up, there were 31,000 available bike days, the sum of all the days when the bikes were in service. And so I'm going to focus on basically April through August. And we're not going to look, although I did have some warm-up data from these previous quarters, it's kind of sparse and not reliable from the purpose that we're interested in. So first a question would be, what's the usage pattern of these bikes by day and by time? And I think you'd probably expect that there would be variability in these usage rates. It's not the same every day. And as we're going to find out, the usage pattern in Columbus is not at all to do with journey to work. People are not commuting on bikes using KOGO. Anyone who wants to use a bike for work probably owns a bike. So this is not a bike commuting system. That's not the same in some other cities. If you have a subway or an accessible point and you need to get a bike as a connector and you walk out of the subway station and there's a bike there, that's fantastic, but we don't have that issue. On the other hand, it turns out our bike system is being used heavily for recreation and access to amenities such as parks, city parks. So that's by design, I think, in terms of where the things are placed. So real data are coming here. Hang on. We have the day of the week. They're going to be the rows of the table. And the columns of the table are going to be times, starting at 8 a.m. So before I put it up, 8 a.m. is going to be here. I'm going to wind the day forward, and the table is going to show the days of the week. And red shaded cells are more heavily used, and green shaded cells are basically not used at all. So quick guess, when are the most heavily used cells? Evening, day of week. Which day? Thursday through Sunday. Very good. So it's tiny print, but the color tells you the picture. So Sundays from about 11 a.m. through all the way through the late evening, Saturdays all the way through the same time period, and even a little bit on Friday and Saturday. The heavier numbers, the bigger numbers are shaded red. And so this sort of, this space-time grid is showing you the heavy use periods, and not much during the early hours of Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. And I think this is probably good news. Not too many bikes are wandering around at 2, 3, and 4, and 5 a.m. So the green numbers here are completely light operations. So this peak demand for the system, consistent with recreation, going to parks, going to restaurants, connecting between, say, the Short North and German Village, the bike system is being used actively for that, and you can easily see this in the data. The demand, then, is variable, and we ought to design the system to comply with this movement pattern. So knowing something about the spatial demand, we can take advantage of that and know something about, we don't need to design it for certain uses because we have a very distinctive pattern of use at the moment here during the first year or so of operation. There is a need to have trend and seasonality, and we should try to capture this in the data. If we know something about a system, it makes sense to try to build that into any model. We also have some random components that are expected beyond regular waves. So you get a special event, you have a community festival, or you have a jazz or ribs fest. You've got a whole lot of different users that if you hear stochastic demand makes this tricky. And I am going to use 2 or 3 slides to talk about models for doing this. But one very simple model would be to think of this as a Markovian model. That's a model where there's a step-by-step movement, and the process is called memoryless. So what you do next is independent of what you did before. And that's certainly true of this system. A bicycle that's at the front in Beck Street couldn't have any recollection of what it did before. So the bike is going next based on a stochastic process. So that's a good thing. That makes this a valid representation of this problem. So we have bikes moving between stations according to a probability function that's relatively easy to calculate from the real data. In fact, I've generated these data from their data, and we have these what are called transition probabilities. Think of that as the chance that a bike sitting at this station is going next to station A, B, C, or D across the grid, and we can populate that with real data. The second good thing about that is that if you have these data and it's a valid representation, you can compute what's called an equilibrium state in each of the systems of states. So that's like the balanced share of the demand for each of the stations if you let this process wind itself out infinitely. So this could be useful. The notation's kind of dense, but these little vectors would tell us what's the expected demand for each of the stations. And it could be based on how people are currently using it. Now, that's the good news. I have an animation of this, but I don't think I'm going to risk getting the laptop to jump to the animation. But just imagine that the colored lines here are bicycles. So a bike starts at station A. It could actually be checked back at station A. The bike could go to station B. The bike could check back into B. So think of these colored lines as the bikes bouncing around between the stations. So these are the Markov transitions of what's happening between all the stations in the system. And although my number example here are just conjured up for this purpose, in reality I can populate this with the real data, the real transition rules, and how much is going between all the stations. So far this looks like a perfect application for a Markov chain. There's one slight catch, and that is if I ran the animation, you'd realize that a Markov chain assumes that you make a transition, and you make another transition, and you make another transition, and another transition. It goes click, 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 click. And in other words, there's an instantaneous selection of the next state having chosen a state. And that is not what bikes do. Bikes get to the station, and they sit there. So there's a holding time. When you get to the station, there's some probability that the bike sits there, and then it later on, maybe a couple of hours or even days later, makes a transition. So we do have to build in, and we have the data to support this as well, we know how long the bikes sit idle once they get there. So this was a really key insight where a model, which sounds good, required us to look to see, do the actual data comply with the standard of the model? There's a separate process for repair. If the bike is out of commission, when the person clicks it back in, they kind of mark it as not working very well, and the system removes it from the bike rack and fixes it and brings it back. So we actually know about bikes being taken offline. So these are bikes that arrived at a station, and we know that the next time they were used was to leave that station, so they sat still there, right? We know also about bikes that came to the station, and the next time they were seen was somewhere else. So then Kogo took them offline and brought them back online. We were careful to separate those two out.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it. A user defines it as a...
Yeah. They also routinely check and maintain and make sure that the bikes are in good condition.
So it could be kind of a real-time app. It could be
yes.
a signal of...
Yeah. Sure. But you're right that there's an important need to be realistic about the way these systems are used. The bike comes in, generally speaking, it sits here for a while, and then it gets checked out again. That's the normal operation. But what about if a bike is here and Kogo needs to take it for rebalancing purposes? We sort of don't know what happens to it till it reappears somewhere else. All we know is that it went offline for some period. But one thing that we do know, I'll come to your question now in a second, is that we have what's likely to be modeled as what's called a semi-Markov process. And the semi-Markov process is just like the Markov process, except we are allowed to have what's called a holding time. And that's perfect for what we need. The bike gets to some place, and with our data, I'm able to calculate its next use. And therefore, I realize, on average, some bikes sit at their stations for an hour or two. Some bikes sit on average for 2 days before they're used again. And that variability is key to computing these semi-Markov weighted holding times. And we can also interpret the difference between the equilibrium probabilities and the Markov weighted semi-Markov values. So we could, as I will show you an example in a minute, we can start telling a reasonably substantive story about which stations have high hold times and which stations have low hold times.
When you said that some bikes have a longer holding time
Yeah.
than other bikes, I assume you aggregate
Yeah.
holding times of all the bikes and then divide it by the bikes to get an average holding time. Because you cannot argue that one bike will
Right.
always have more holding time than
Right. There's some really neat things like that, exactly, where, in fact, since I know the bikes have an ID number, so I can check the bike in and out, and I know how long the bike sat there. And then I'm going to average over all the bikes by station. So HJ here is the holding time averaged over all bikes at that station. Anand, did you have a question? Or?
This was it. Thanks.
Okay. So.
You answered. That slide answered that question.
Good. So here's the type of, so this is about data, but it's also about analysis. So here's the type of data that I have possession of, things like transitions, the demand and capacity of the stations, time of day use, and holding time. And I think the interesting thing is that, as academics, we'd probably say this is mathematically an applied work of some interest. But if you're trying to tell the story to, average person in the dispatch, you need to probably translate it into something like, what's the normal way to say some of these things in terms of movement, usage, activity, idle. And I think, as I said at the beginning, I'm quite interested in helping COGO do a great job. So, are there some concerns about some of their statistics that might allow us to say, this station is really troubled and this one is doing extremely well, or stories of those kinds. So I actually picked a couple of stations, and this one is one of the busier stations in the system at 3rd and Gay Street. And here are some standard numbers that I'm going to report for this station and 3 others. And you're going to be able to compare them. So from means how many bikes over this 135 days were checked out. So 1,500 bikes checked out from the station over the 4-month period, and 1,395 checked in. So immediately you say, this is not symmetric. It's not like your car, you go to work and you go back and back and back. In fact, bikes are often imbalanced, where bikes leave from a system and don't necessarily come back to the same place. The equilibrium share of this station is about 5% of the system. So this is a busy, heavily demanded station that has a vibrant amount of activity. Bear that in mind, because not all the stations are like this. Secondly, this is a station, and this is the HJ measure for that station, has quick turnover. Bikes come in there and they get clicked out fairly quickly. These are in days, so about 1/2 day on average is the hold time for a bike at that station. If you use the hold time and the probabilities together, you can weight them and realize this is responsible for about 3.7% of the business of this system. And this is a key thing. When I show you a map later, remember that I said Gay Street is a station that's depleting. It's not a bad thing. It just means that bikes tend to get taken away from that station and don't get brought back. So it's a bike station that has a downward sloping usage trend. So the COGO system must, and they do, have to add bikes back to that location to make it work. So they're constantly replenishing that station. The notable usage of this station, given you know this is in the city center, close to restaurants and bars and so on, it has notably heavy usage on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Okay, so here's a picture of if you just let this system run its course with no intervention, you would be down 180 bikes at Gay Street within the 4 months, yes.
I'm just curious. So you said there was like 163 bikes that had to be like put back in the station. So
Net, yes.
So are there people, is that
Yes.
resources? There are people hired to just
Absolutely,
bike the bike back?
$12 an hour.
Really?
Yep. They have a truck and they load the bikes on the back. You can go on COGO and look at their advertising for positions. And what I'm trying to convey by that is it's kind of an entry-level position where people are balancing and removing bikes from systems and putting them back in other locations.
But all day? That's what
Not necessarily. All day is very expensive. So that's a key thing. How often do you rebalance to make sure that you don't spend all your money on balancing? So strategically rebalancing is something I'm interested in, and we'll get to that. So this is 3rd and Gay Street. Bicentennial Park, you know where this is? It's on the riverfront where there's a restaurant. And this is a system, a very busy node in the system. It has 2,200 bikes in and 2,300 bikes out. It has a high share of demand. It has very quick turnover, bikes clicked in and out all the time. And it has a 3.2 share of the whole system. Bikes accumulate here. So bikes get brought there, and you don't necessarily have to take the bike home after you've had dinner. You can get a taxi or get a ride with friends or take a car to go or some other system, Uber, taxi, whatever. So this system is a place where bikes accumulate, so the COGO folks have to remove bikes from here. They have to take them away. Its notable usage pattern is Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And one thing we noticed from our data analysis, it's actually used as a connecting hub. Because of that 30-minute time limit I mentioned, it sort of makes sense to ride the bike to Bicentennial Park, click it in, click it back out again. You can notice that in the data because there's a number of uses of that station where the interval between the click in and click out is so short that it wasn't just a normal, transfer, like I put the bike in and then you got it. No, yeah.
How do you adjust for that when looking at the whole patterns at this and other similar stations?
Notice I just measured the mean hold time, so the variance of hold time at this station would be quite high. There'd be lots of very short ones. But for now, I just figured, it is one of the facts about the station. There's a lot of clicking in, and it's the only station where I could reasonably surely say that that's happening. It may happen also at some of the others. So Bicentennial Park, if you just let time run by, would be accumulating bikes, so you have to correct for that by taking them away. So very, very quickly, I'm not sure if you can, any local geographical expertise here. Where is this? This is Cleveland and Mount Vernon, and you see a lot of bikes? This is a problem station. In the entire 4.5 months, only 271 bikes were taken from that station, and only 234 came back. And the average holding time of a bike at that station is 2.25 days. So this is a bike station, because of its location and because of its position, is underused. Now, I'm not complaining about that. I'm just saying that that's an observation about the location. Yeah.
Go back to the technology.
Yeah.
Do all racks here have the same size?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. This is a fixed uniform station, really. It's a physical hardware that's quite costly to maintain and put in. So the bike clicks in and clicks out, yeah. I have photographs of other stations, and they're all going to look, see, they all have the same sort of bike hardware, I guess.
Yeah, no, but there's the same number of spots.
Oh, no. Bike stations are sized, and the biggest one is the Third and Gay. It has 19 slots. This one, I'm not quite remembering, but it's probably in the 13 or so. So location and size. So a geographer has a field day here because two of the key variables are very analyzable, how big to make the system, where to put them. So this is Cleveland and Mount Vernon. And this is Neil and Nationwide. And this is actually an emerging success story because in the first few months of operation, this one was tanking also. But over time, it has greatly increased its use 900 bikes in and out, equilibrium probability, hold pattern, average, and bicycles accumulate here. But the notable thing is if you took a time series of this station, its usage is increasing, maybe through more vitality in the arena district or various promotion of the system. Okay, so implications from the findings. So we could use this system to perhaps estimate or adjust expected station size. We could possibly exploit the predictable need to redistribute from points of consistent accumulation to depletion stations. So anytime you know something about a spatial system, you may be able to take advantage of that and exploit it or model to take advantage of the facts. You might be able to model the route for redistribution of bikes. So while the person currently doing it, making minimum wage and doing a good job, doesn't really have a huge challenging problem, the equivalent of this problem in New York City or Paris or Montreal are enormous. The balancing questions are much more difficult if you have a lot of system states. So let's look in more detail. That wasn't the last slide, by the way. There's a sort of a detailed look at each of these three issues. Based on what we found, what are some of the implications for balance, for timing and expansion. So you do all this data analysis, you hope you find something that might be useful. So rebalancing, here's a quotation from my friend Heather Bowden, who works for COGO. We have our staff continually check this throughout the day. We rebalance as needed. She told me this back in February when the system was new. It's a bit too early to identify conclusive long-term patterns. The staff has a sense of the station usage and is able to troubleshoot and take a proactive approach to certain stations at certain times, such as Bicentennial Park during lunchtime or at the weekend. So right now it's a small-scale operation that's being done quite effectively by old-fashioned pencil and paper means. If the system was not right-sized or imbalances occurred, the bikes could be badly adjusted and the whole thing would go out of whack. So here's the slide that I want to talk about. The math problems of doing this optimally are intense. This journal is discrete optimization, this journal is science, and this is City Lab, and these are all within the last couple of months. There's been a huge outpouring of mathematical effort to optimize bike sharing and balancing systems. Why? Because of those 600 cities globally that have this exact problem. So bike sharing systems solving the static rebalancing problem, wheels when you need them, I would say where you need them as well, and balancing bike stations has become a serious scientific endeavor. So I'm not pretending we can do all of this, but here are some advanced ideas that you might put into rebalancing more effectively. This is, at essence, going to be a capacitated vehicle routing problem. You have a trailer with bikes. You have to somehow get them to wend between the stations, picking up and dropping off, and making sure that the bike system, as a result of the routing, is balanced. The cost of this effort is a major aspect of the operational cost of large systems. It's not that a big deal at Columbus just yet, but bigger systems have this problem in much heavier detail. So based on the geography insights that we've done, I'll blow up this map in a minute. So a station with more departures than arrivals must be balanced by a net inflow. A station with accumulating bikes provides us with a pool for transfers. And the question is, I hope you think about this, is where are these stations? Where are the pluses and minuses? So can you see this reasonably well? So remember 3rd and Gay Street? And the symbol I showed you at the beginning was this was a station where bikes deplete. I showed you the downward graph. So this is a station where COGO has to bring bikes in. So green symbols are stations where bikes are transferred in on net. And red stations like Bicentennial Park are stations where bikes accumulate and can be taken out. So red stations are accumulating, green stations are depleting. I see a pretty strong spatial pattern here. The core central locations tend to be places where bikes deplete out, and around the edge, the red stations, more or less, are accumulating bikes. Yellow's in between. And by the way, this is on net. Not every day does COGO take bikes away from some place and bring them back. Sometimes they're bringing, sometimes they're taking away. But on net, they need to replenish bikes here and remove bikes here. So if I was designing some kind of optimal vehicle routing for this, I would probably sweep down, pick up some bikes, drop them off, and sweep back. That's the subject of an ongoing research project, the optimal routing of vehicles to redesign what's being currently done by pencil and paper. Second implication and expansion would be the time protocol. This issue of the fact you must bring the bike within a 30-minute window to avoid overcharges. The predominant use then, understandably, is between stations that are less than 30 minutes apart. And people are actively avoiding the overcharge. So this is suited to people going from A to B as opposed to a day trip or leisure use or sort of wandering around on a more loosely connected trip. If we talk to people about the system, and this is my one detour into actual users as opposed to, did a quick survey and found out that this is the biggest issue that people have with the system. They would love to have a more generous time window. And if you did, you would end up with bikes perhaps getting more unbalanced because you would give more freedom to operate. So second best solutions might be where the operator may play with the system in such a way as to make it easy for them to balance things, possibly at some expense of giving a full range of options to the user. In other words, the balance of power would shift slightly towards COGO, and they might choose to leave empty racks open for some time with the expectation that they're sort of playing the numbers that the bikes will return or rebalance themselves. Yeah?
Either you or Jennifer make any distinctions between annual permit holders and day trippers? It doesn't even matter?
It's in the data, but I didn't really look at that because, frankly, the number of people actually paying at the fare box is pretty small. So most of the people using this are subscribers. And one of the things they hoped was that COGO would be attractive and you'd walk up and say, hey, I need a bike, here's $3, I'm off. Well, in fact, the charge is $6. So there's an optimal pricing question there. And location tends to be something that probably is worked into this. So if you had a smartphone-enabled app, you could perhaps signal to users the availability of bikes, maybe with discounts or premiums or benefits to, if you take the bike here, since you're helping us, we may give you a discount on your return. Just saying. So third implication would be expansion. A lot of people want to know, well, when can we get COGO to our neighborhood, because it seems like a great thing. So the system currently has 30 stations. What would be the added existing added locations? How big should they be? Where should they be? How would they be meshed in? That gets me all excited because it's a geographical and spatial question. So, would we bring this to Grandview, to Granville, to areas around the city? So existing literature has suggested a large number of hub and spoke models as a good way to optimize this. And that gets me excited again because I've done a lot of work on location using hub and spoke. I would actually be critical of whether the hub and spoke protocol is correct for this, because there are some nuances. Yeah.
So if you haven't already,
yeah,
you would have a great interest from the undergraduate student government on campus.
Yes, yes.
Because they're in the middle of proposing.
Yes. I was at a meeting where they were represented and they were making a strong pitch for having COGO expand to campus, of course. And that's Jennifer's work was somewhat to do with the background analysis to support that or to check. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's pretty heavy price tags associated with this. So, the physical station is a costly operation. How many and where should they be? So if you stay tuned for 1 second, I have another slide that might suggest some of that issue. So very briefly, this may seem out of order, but this is kind of my literature review at the end. So these guys, Shaheen, Guzman, and Zhang, did an excellent literature review sort of talking about the stages of evolution of bike systems. And I would say Columbus right now is in an IT-based system. It has some information technology, it has some feedback to smartphones, et cetera. But the authors propose a fourth-generation demand-responsive multimodal system. That's the next thing. And that would be where I actually incentivize you to do what I want you to do. So I give you a discount to bring the bike back up the hill. Okay? So a broader impact, a workshop organized by graduate students here, emphasized a focus on various modes of transport and included infrastructure and systems for more active bicycle use, kind of a sustainable argument. It's clear from the audience and the interest in this that there's an intense interest in environmentally friendly and safe travel by bicycle. So the fourth generation ideas would be more efficient redistribution methods, incentivized-based redistribution, seamless integration of bike sharing with other public transport modes, such as taxis and car sharing, and then uniform smart cards which support numerous transport modes on a single card. So it's like seamless between the systems. They are great ideas, and this is from this Shaheen literature review, which is in the notes there. And then finally, more flexible geography. I realize now this slide is slightly too small to see in detail, but if you're interested, go online and check out Berlin's bike sharing system. It's a truly massive system, a very large system. It's obviously heavily used, and it has an idea that may be under development, but also could be instructive for us. Notice these bikes are not actually docked in any hardware. They're more like in a zone. So the bikes have a more open set of places where we know that they're here. We don't need to build like a $1,000 bike rack to know that the bikes are clicked in. So having a more flexible geography. Some of these systems also have what you might think of as mobile stations. So you bring a rack of bikes to a location and put them at a place where they're needed. So you could gauge the demand, and instead of having to build it and see if they come, realize we made a mistake, we could potentially alter and locate them differently. So thanks for your attention. Comments are definitely very welcome. It's work in progress. I also like to thank Kira and Heather Bowden for the data. Kogo is extremely open with providing shared data. Harvey Miller, my colleague, Ying Song, a grad student, Jennifer Evans-Cowley for discussions. And the photos, in many cases, are stock photos from Kogo's website. So thanks for your attention. We'd be happy to take any questions.